All right. Hey, everybody. I'm Maddie Reardon. I'm the Community Engagement Manager at Radio Milwaukee, and I'd like to welcome you to our conversation, Solidarity in Action. A couple of reminders. If you are not a panelist or a moderator, please mute your microphones. I would suggest changing your view in the upper right-hand corner to speaker view so that you can concentrate on whomever is speaking in the moment. If you have questions or suggestions for resources, please take advantage of the chat function. I'm going to be compiling all of the resources and potentially the questions from that chat function to send out to everybody after the event concludes. If we do have time at the end, we are going to be taking questions, so please feel free to put them in the chat. Before I hand it over to our moderator, I just want to take a moment to preface this conversation. We as Radio Milwaukee recognize that our listener base is largely made up of people who identify as white. We also recognize that it is our duty to use our platforms to educate our listeners. You may have noticed that our panel is made up of people who identify as white. The intention of this is meant to take a bit of burden off of our Black and Brown community to always have to answer the questions, what can I do, or how can I do it better? Or how can I be better? This conversation is being held in part so that white people can do the work of talking about recognizing privilege, unlearning internal racist practices that we may not even realize we have, and working to improve our actions to operate in solidarity with Black and Brown people in our community and beyond. Our moderator and panelists are openly and consistently working to be better and can share lessons they've learned along the way. As the community engagement manager here at Radio Milwaukee, and as an individual who identifies as white, I recognize that I'm not always going to get it right, but I'm actively listening and actively working to better myself in the space of race and racism, and I hope that each of you is here today to do the same. This conversation is a very small piece of a hugely complex issue, and this is not our first nor our last conversation around race and racism. If you have not yet listened to the audio from one of our previous events, How to Have Better Conversations About Race, I encourage you to do so as it serves as another conversation piece. A huge thanks to our panelists and moderator. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator for today, Renee Scampini, to take it from here.
Hey, thanks, Maddie. Just co-signing on what Maddie just said, we have to talk about whiteness to know how to show up appropriately, dismantle systems of racism, and not make it about white feelings or centering whiteness. And I've learned a ton from the folks on the panel today. So thanks. Quickly introduce the panelists. Jonathan Prost, Wisconsin State Assembly. Kirsten Helgeson, Just a Girl Incorporated. Kyle Pfister, Ninjas for Health. Dr. Stephanie Baran, Instructor of Sociology. And Stephanie Rhodes, Showing Up for Racial Justice, or SURJ, S-U-R-J, Milwaukee. And just a quick review, we'll try to stick to 2 minutes a question because I know we have a lot to cover, and I'll kind of jump in when that time is nearing. Maddie is going to help me with that too, but I'll basically state the question, ask the panelists in order of alphabetical order, and call on them directly just to make it easier for an online conversation. And then we'll go down the line from there. So this first question will be a two-parter. There are benefits and privileges to being white that exist because of historic enduring racism and biases that are rooted in the fabric of everyday life. It's something that white people are born into and must be acknowledged before we work on becoming anti-racist. The first question is, can you give examples from your life of how you benefited from being white, and how and when did you learn that? We'll start with Jonathan.
Sure. First off, thanks for having me and for all the panels and stuff like that or whatever. Basically, I would say that, yeah, I could give quite a few examples. I think I've benefited a lot. I'll give two quick ones, one when I was a child and one much more recently. When I was a little kid growing up, and I'll touch on this, I think, a little bit later, too, because I think it's relevant for the discussion. But, you know, growing up in Milwaukee and going to majority Black schools and stuff like that or whatever, you have, like, a very different experience dealing with, for example, police than a lot of my fellow schoolmates and peers and stuff like that. And so I remember just, being able to see police and think baseball cards and bubble gum, and not that I'm going to get my head slammed to a car on the concrete or stuff like that, because, I'm fit the description, or might be, drug stuff or whatever. So I think that's a pretty clear example of growing up of the wildly different experiences, even though it was all from the same city and stuff like that. It was just completely different experiences growing up. And then more recently, it's been, I guess, today's going to be 33 days straight of, demonstrations as far as marching and stuff like that. And earlier, and I've, been, trying to show up and, go to each one of these, but one of them happened to be in Menominee Falls. And at that one, it was a place that refused service to some of the Black folk marching with us in order to, buy some treats and go to the bathroom and stuff like that. This was at Speedway. And so Speedway on Menominee Falls on Main Street and Shady Lane. I'm not making that up. That's actually where it's at. But when I went down there, I was, let me go document this to show people what's going on. And also, so a lot of white people who don't know this stuff happens regularly because, again, it's not their experience. Like they talk about me being a little kid, not my experience, but it doesn't mean it doesn't happen just because it doesn't happen to you type stuff. So I started documenting it, and then the crowd was ready to kind of move on because they wanted to get to this racist alderperson or common council member's house and go protest in the comments he made about using live ammunition against Black Lives Matter protesting people. And so, but I was like, I'm sticking here. And I had the privilege of being white when they called 6 cops to come to the gas station because they closed it down. Someone kidnapped one of the patrons in there. She wouldn't let him out. And they had to have this huge police escort and, all this big show of force and stuff like that. Because I was staying around and because these other folks were there. But again, me being white, I had the privilege to be like, all right, I'm staying here and I'm recording and I can talk stuff to the police and da-da-da. But would I have felt that way if I was Black? I don't think so. Probably my life experience and personal experiences might have led me to a very different, mentality, what the outcome could be. So I think those are 2 examples from my past as well as one much more recently that are pretty relevant. You know what I'm saying?
Thanks. Kirsten, same question.
Thanks, Renee. So happy to be here. Thanks for having me. So I've been really aware of my privilege for a long time now. I've been in the diversity and inclusion space for about 15 years. And I'm going to put 2 examples out there. One was when I was a teenager. We're all kind of young, dumb, stupid at 16, like I was for sure. And I grew up in the northern suburbs. I grew up in Cedarburg. And so I would get in my car being, the 16-year-old self that I was, all sassy and know-it-all. And I'd drive a bat out of hell down the street. And every day there would be a cop sitting at this one little corner. And every day he would pull me over. And he knew exactly who I was. He knew where I lived, all of this stuff. And he would look at me and pull me over and say, "Oh, Kirsten, you're going a little fast today, aren't you?" And I would say, "Oh, yeah, I'm so sorry. I just didn't even realize it, And he would be like, "Well, you be safe today and I'll see you tomorrow," basically, and send me off on my way. And that right there, I think, is a really good example of my white female privilege, just being able to blow off the fact that I was driving really fast on the road and getting repeatedly pulled over by a police officer who treated me like I was his own daughter versus treating me like I was a threat. And I think that is a really good example of my youth. And then as I've gotten older, I think that I've become even more aware of the intricacies of privilege. And I do a lot of international work in challenging environments with lots of different kinds of layered privilege and racism and oppression and all that sort of stuff. And so whenever I'm in, I do a lot of work with refugees. And so whenever I'm in a refugee camp, I'll have women start coming up to me and patting my skin, literally touching my body and asking me if I'm married or if I'm in a relationship because they could get me a really good husband because of my really light skin. And, even when we look at safety in these places, I can move about the planet and in difficult environments and different situations with ease and protection versus all of the different people, Black people, Indigenous folks, the BIPOC community can navigate it in a little more difficult, challenging kind of a way. And so I've become really clear of like the big ways that my privilege benefits me and also like the small little intricate ways. And it's done that for, you know, pretty much my entire life.
Thanks. Kyle.
Hey everybody. Yeah, thanks so much for having me and for this conversation. I'm really excited to be here. I think we talk a lot about white privilege because we think if we can talk enough about this, we can convince white folks to actually see the Black experience, but that these conversations about privilege can also be super supremacist, because the conversation shouldn't be how we have it so much better than Black people, but that we white people every single day decide to keep it that way. And that's not just white privilege, it's actually white pathology. So we white folks are afflicted with this deadly disease of white supremacy that infiltrates our worldview. It's how we operate professionally and ultimately the impact that we have on the world. And so for me, whiteness is a deep moral failing. It's something that tugs at me. It tugs at the souls of a lot of white folks I know, that we should really have trouble sleeping at night with how our impact of our whiteness creates impacts in the world around us, including among folks that we love dearly and we work directly with. So asking ourselves questions like, why do we feel so entitled? Why do we get so defensive? Why do we stay so silent sometimes? Why don't we sometimes lack the instincts to confront and attack an unfair system, and instead we stay quiet? So I find that through whiteness, we have to begin to relearn some basic human skills that can heal ourselves as human beings from this affliction of whiteness. Things like listening, very basic things, following, being corrected. How do we hold ourselves accountable? How do we stand up for what's right? How do we love ourselves and other people fully? So I find anti-racism is not charity work to help Black folks, but it's for our own liberation too from whiteness. And so I used to start these conversations about, let's talk about all the terrible ways that Black folks are harmed across these systems. But what we're here to talk about today is that we all know all this. We've known it for decades, and we're still living our normal lives, relatively normal lives, okay with this immorality, and that is whiteness. So we get super distracted by keeping up a reputation of how to not be perceived as racist. I've certainly fallen into that trap. With empty language about diversity, shallow symbols like all of our Facebook posts, charitable work that comes from a good place, but ends up just being self-gratification. So all this performance really covers up the real disease, which is that we are pained by whiteness and we need to heal it through anti-racism. So for me, being an active anti-racist is to speak and live this truth that we too are afflicted by whiteness, and that we need to commit to dismantling and redesigning our lives to fix this. And how it came about this, and realizing this about my own whiteness, is it happened very gradually, and honestly, much too slowly, over 15 years. And for me, it was working authentically organizing in community by being led by some powerful Black and brown leaders, and learning to trust the voices of some amazing Black women in my life that have given me some of this feedback. But it took me a while to sort of process through how my whiteness is showing up.
Thanks a lot. Stephanie. Sorry, thanks, Kyle. Stephanie B, are you in yet?
Yeah, I'm in.
Yay, hi.
Thank you so much for having me. I was on the wrong link, like the typical professor who's absent. Just anyway, hi everyone. Like Kyle, much of my experience happened far too late. But for me, I really didn't really understand or was aware of this thing. I knew that racism was bad as a teenager, as a kid, and I had parents that had treat everybody the same, the regular sort of like 80s, 90s connection to how you have humanity. But it wasn't really till I was 26 and I was in my master's program that I had a professor who I took a racism and resistance course at DePaul University. I'm also a fib. Hi. With that class, it really was that first moment when I was like 26, 27, where I had this class where it opened my eyes. And now I teach students, and I think sometimes, I think back to when I was a kid and I was like, I wasn't a bad white person in the sense that, I wasn't using slurs, but I also wasn't aware of my whiteness. So it wasn't like I was a great one either. But it's this moment of, it's never a moment of, okay, well, I learned all this race stuff. Clearly I'm great now. I don't need to, continue my learning. It's this moment of always being, self-reflexive and making sure that I'm consistently taking in the information. Listening is key, and making sure that when I'm teaching my students, I'm teaching them from a perspective of the voices of color, scholars of color, women of color, trans women of color, trans people of color, of all BIPOC and all of these experiences, because that is what's going to continually push us forward into this continual learning pattern. Because it's just because I studied doesn't mean like, ooh, I've got it. It's always taking stock, being self-reflexive, and so that's how I sort of look back on all the experiences I had, to present, and how I can continue these experiences to, each coming day, to make sure that I'm taking stock of that, and making sure that I'm continually challenging myself, because that's key.
Thanks. Stephanie R. Stephanie, I think you're on mute.
That's so me. I'm on brand. Hi, thanks for having me. And I appreciate you continuing to have these spaces so that we can model how to have these conversations in all the different pockets of life that we interact in. I think that's really important. I think that when I moved to the Milwaukee area about 20 years ago, like privilege was just such a expanded notion, because it's the segregation that happens in this area just exacerbates what privilege looks like. And when I see these articles come out that talk about Milwaukee or Wisconsin being such a great place to live, I always say, for who? Because all of the things that are bragged about in these articles are things that occur in segregated white spaces. We segregated the land out, we took the land, the parks, we moved all the jobs into our white segregated spaces. The police work for us to protect our ownership of all that and our ownership of the capitalism, and it just creates such a space too that's protected, where you don't have to even think about race or racism or have any kind of difficult conversations and be culpable in any way. That your participation in just living in these segregated communities is part of privilege and an active part of racism. And I kind of started learning this when we started doing, Reggie Jackson, of course, like his workshops talking about the different counties and the history of segregation and racism were really impactful for me. And then starting to do workshops and anti-racism work, when you start doing them in the suburbs, you start to realize just how drastically different everything looks when you get there versus how things are in Milwaukee. And nobody will cross over. We couldn't have them in Milwaukee. People wouldn't come from the suburbs. And that's a privilege right there, that you can protect yourself in these spaces and not have to feel vulnerable or, see the effects of what segregation has done in southeastern Wisconsin. And vice versa, working with Black organizers, we couldn't do a lot of things that were like retreat-like spaces because it wasn't safe for them to even travel into some of the areas that these retreats were being held in. So those were two experiences in organizing, at least, that have really highlighted privilege and racism here.
Thanks, Stephanie. Okay, question 2. We've seen a recent rapid increase in the number of white people amplifying messages and voices of Black and brown leaders, educators, activists, community members, and organizers. Many of the white folks here listening are here to learn how to appropriately commit to solidarity beyond amplification, recognizing that getting involved as a white person has caused harm and can continue to cause additional harm to marginalized communities. Can you give any examples of how you learned to show up in solidarity with Black and brown people and minimize harm? And we're going to start with Kirsten.
Ooh, first one out of the gate, scary. So I would say I got really lucky in the fact that I was able to start my career off pretty early in the corporate social responsibility, diversity and inclusion, strategic philanthropy space. And so right away, as I started jumping into that, I was learning about how to build meaningful connection and how to move people toward meaningful action. And you can't authentically do those things without understanding people and where they're at and where they're coming from, and reflexively to see that in yourself. And so I would say that that work from the start has really turned into this like transitional process for me of evolving and opening up as a human being to the notion that I have been given certain gifts because of just like the luck of the lottery of where I was born and who I was born to. And I think, you know, it's about, I'm one of those people that I always joke, like I have a big mouth, so I better put a lot of money where my mouth is, kind of thing. And so that means I have to show up with a lot of action in there. And so I have to really kind of dig into myself on a constant basis, that if I'm asking people along my whole career, that if I'm asking you to show up as your authentic self, if I'm asking you to lean in and build productive communities or to change the world around you, then I better be doing that myself, because I can't ask anything of another person that I wouldn't first do for myself. And so for me, it's really been challenging and committing to that challenge over the long run. You know, I was a corporate girl for 12 years, and within that comes its own set of very complex privilege and systemic oppression and opportunity and all of these different things. And so I actually left corporate 4 years ago, actually right today. Like today is my 4-year anniversary of leaving corporate. And it was because I felt like I could make change happen faster with my own two hands versus being within an institution. And so I've made strategic decisions all along the way to constantly push myself and to say, am I showing up for people in the way that I say that I am? Am I making choices and exhibiting actions that would embody the kind of person I want to be? Am I challenging notions and beliefs that I held sacred about myself in ways that are productive for the greater good around me? You know, and now I've built an organization, Just a Girl, where really we use technology to foster mental health and women's empowerment efforts globally. And so as I've been digging into that, as I build out these different programs and ways that we're helping people develop, you know, mental health around their different lived experiences, as well as fostering support and solutions, it's like this constant undulation and this constant challenge I have for myself of how can I be better? How can I listen better? How can I understand more? How can I lean in? And I'm gotten very comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I think that's probably one of the most important factors for anyone that's starting their journey in all of this, is like, this is uncomfortable and it's going to be hard and you need to become okay with that. And so I know for ourselves, we're actually been trying to put like frameworks together of how people can understand their privilege and move from the emotional components of privilege into action in a meaningful way for each person's community. And so we've been doing a lot of work right now about all of that, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it. But yeah, I mean, I've constantly been challenging myself in that way and talking to people, putting myself in different kinds of communities, and just knowing that my privilege is a tool. I almost see it like armor, and it's my job to use that tool, that armor, in the most effective way possible for the benefit of more people than I can possibly imagine. And so how do I make those choices every day that embody that spirit?
Great, thanks. Kyle.
Sure. So my background is decades of work in public health, which I love very deeply, which is a field that digs deep into how our various systems affect our health, usually without us even knowing it. And so for me, there's no bigger system than white supremacy, a system that we built on purpose, that we all often pretend doesn't exist, but that we have to actively dismantle and take apart in order to achieve a just and healthy world for all. So for me, I had to grow from my professional work into anti-racism becoming more of a lifestyle that I do in areas across my whole life to make me a moral person. So for me, in my personal life, I started by just showing up. So I like to do more than I like to talk, like was just mentioned, which makes today a little uncomfortable. But I had to sort of unlearn from books to deprofessionalize, to remove some of the language, remove some of the models, and just to show up. That for me, this work in my personal life is less rocket science and more being a kind human being and showing up as that authentically. So I serve by being a volunteer and not being above any task or taking any direction. So I think often in your own organization or professional work, you're used to being the one who writes the plans or who leads. But in this space, you are a guest and usually you're new. So your work could be sweeping up the floor at the end of events, and you start by being of service first. So that's where I started. And then from there, find your specific skill set that you have and use it for the movement. So for me, the way that looks in my life is I'm a couponer. So I learned how to source food and supplies for super cheap and use my hauls for organizations and even run silent event giveaways so I can raise money. I get really pissed when I see how our media portrays Black folks in our city, which happens nearly every night if you watch the network news. So I've learned how to call reporters and provide that accountability, ask them about their racist framing, try to pitch Black and brown reporters or an angle that they're not addressing. I learned how to build relationships with my elected officials, making sure that I can call them, get on a first name basis, share that how my personal story and my family is affected by issues of racial justice, and that constituents, specifically white constituents, will care and will vote for these issues. So as I'm doing that in my personal work, I've learned to minimize harm by always remembering that I'm a guest, like I said, in these racial justice spaces, and I have to act like that. So I have to prove that I'm adding value by actually creating value. I need to mind my business and mind my role, which is tough for a lot of us white folks, and that I'm not entitled to feel welcome in these spaces, right? Because I helped create these problems. So it's easy, even during these protest times, especially, to think that you're joining in the march, you're joining in the cause, but really the protesters are protesting you. They are protesting your whiteness. So our work is to undo that whiteness in the systems that we influence. So it's easier to just grab a sign, but it's harder to say like, wow, they're speaking to me and my systems, and I need to work on it. Reacting to those protester demands, not by marching, but by undoing my own whiteness. And so that's a shift to embrace that responsibility for me, that it's not a choice or a hobby, but it's like the work that we are required to do, or we're being demanded to do.
He's saying a shift is like going from one.
So that's how I show up and try to do this work myself.
Thank you. Stephanie B., you're next. You're also muted.
Thanks. Hi. Doing great today, clearly. Like Kyle, when I was, so I was a PhD student at UWM and University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee. And when I was first starting out on my dissertation, I was looking at poverty, and I had no idea where this whole dissertation would lend me. And so I reached out to a couple of food pantries because I just didn't want to show up, because that's like super white. Just be like, hey, I'm here. And I wanted to make sure that they knew that it was okay if I came, if it was, cool. And so at All People's, there's a community lunch and a pantry every day. And I met with one of the admins there, and she got me in touch with the pastor, the day pastor, and the day pastor actually talked to the pantry patrons to see if they were cool with me coming in. And that was important to me, because I certainly just did not want to just like come into the space and be like, hey, be part of my study, without having it be okay. The other part to that is that there has to be a level of trust and rapport, specifically with under-resourced and and marginalized individuals and communities, specifically by university systems that go into communities to like data farm and then leave real quick, which is hella problematic. And so to make sure that they, the pantry patrons understood where I was coming from and the mode, I would make sure that I would go back every Wednesday, do the same speech, and eventually the pantry manager, welcomed me into the space and asked if I would do some duties and take care of the dishes. And like Kyle, that's not my space. So whatever you need me to do, you are the expert. I am not. I'm gonna do whatever you need me to do and have no problem with it, right? And it doesn't matter. And over time, I ended up building that rapport and building that trust and really gaining not just stories and experiences, but friends that I talk to all the time, right? And it's through that trust and the building of that trust and the idea and the understanding on my part that I am not owed that at all. In fact, I owe them, the pantry patrons and the pantry itself, this work to push it forward. And it's through those experiences that these stories of how folks navigate poverty become richer because of that. They're just not flat, regular stories. They're, you have intricate details about people's lives. You get invited to hang out with them, and and their families, and meet their relatives, and it really becomes a more enriching experience for everybody. But also it's knowing how you as a person can, when you're going to enter a space, you're not entering a space with this, sense of expertise, but a sense of duty that you have to complete you need to complete these tasks as a worker and not as an expert. And so that's sort of how I approach it when I go into a new space. Number one, I want to make sure that it's okay that I'm there. And then two, make sure that people know what I'm doing and that I'm transparent, build a rapport, and then eventually get that trust, because I'm not owed that trust. I have to earn that trust. And I think that's something that, as a white person and whiteness in general, we think, oh, we're good, so it's fine, so people trust us. We need to build that over time.
Thanks, Stephanie. Stephanie R.
I think that my experience started kind of similar to Stephanie B's. I don't work in nonprofit. I don't do public speaking. I'm horrible at public speaking, especially living on the spectrum. It makes me just very awkward all the time. So I'm the kind of person that likes to show up in spaces to do work, like to do a task or work on strategy or do something behind the scenes. And then Milwaukee went through this period of time where we started to have all these like conversations about race, but it was always, let's put 3 Black people in a space with 3 white people so that they can hear each other's stories, and that will somehow solve this problem that we're having. And I just started to notice that white people were showing up woefully ill-prepared to have discussions about race, because as we know in segregation, we don't have to have those conversations, so we don't have to be good at it. And we were showing up in those spaces thinking that what we had to say was equally as important as what a Black person has to say from Milwaukee. And those spaces became super harmful. Like Black people had to sit there and listen to this crap from white people and not say anything because of certain rules of order and stuff like that. So when I would speak, I would actually use that space to call these white people over to the side to have other conversations about what we were talking about and stuff like that. And I think it just started to get noticed a little bit and recognized by Black leaders in that space. And then that's kind of how the Surge group came about, is that they asked for a different, broader space where we could call people to have that work, so that when we do show up in racial justice work and actual anti-racism work, that we're doing it more productively and effectively. So that's kind of how I came into being a co-learner in this space. And so that just continues to build the skill of how do I continue to show up in a way that's less harmful. And that's a lot of listening and knowing your leadership, because the person that's leading a space could be completely different from a different leader that's going to lead the next space that you're in. And we can't tokenize Black voices that way. We can't say, well, this one Black leader told me that this was okay in this space, because that may not be okay in that next space. So you have to really know the messaging that you're being asked to take part in, especially learn the tact of not centering yourself in that space, which is really hard for white people, because sometimes we think we're doing the right thing, that we're amplifying something, but we're really just making ourselves the center of it. And be able to take criticism on the spot, and my hurt feelings aren't going to kill me, and so I can just shut up and move aside. Or if I have to, if I'm being called in to say, get these white people out of here, I can collect these white people, get out of there. I'm just there to do what I'm told, and try to do it in a way that I can also take these white people and give them an experience that's not shaming or distancing myself from them, but saying like, look, okay, let's call ourselves in this moment and talk about why we're being harmful, so that we can actually do something productive from that space too. Part of that is also getting over my white supremacy culture of perfectionism and sense of urgency. When I started getting in these spaces, I wanted to be really good at everything I did. I didn't want to say the wrong things. But I actually learned that by making those mistakes and being very public about it, that we can learn from each other, and that modeling is really important to show other white people how to have those conversations. So that's why I appreciate the Surge page and like other pages where there's like discussions of whiteness and stuff like that, so that people can see other people's conversations and learn from those spaces. And just reading the critiques online of, especially right now, there's a lot of Black leaders talking about all the different actions going on across the country, and the critiques that I'm hearing of different places are really important to learn from those so that we can try to either not make them here or at least learn the things that worked really well somewhere else and try to duplicate those here too, you know, just kind of do that and just make sure that I have a diversity of voices that I'm using to build my own internal compass about how I navigate anti-racism work.
Thanks, Stephanie. Jonathan.
I want to start off by saying Stephanie Rhodes has one of the best, sharpest, and most severe senses of humor on Facebook, and is hilarious. You should all follow her if you've not yet. Do yourself a favor.
Oh, don't follow.
Check out her flavor online. She's fantastic. You will not be disappointed. That being said, yeah, I guess, you know, it's a lot that's been out there and stuff like that. I guess for me, one of the, you know, the only advice I'll add on to that, and I think to answer the question, is that I've spent a lot of times being the only white person in the room, and it's very helpful to me. Something my rabbi taught me years ago, which always stuck with me: if you're comfortable, you're not growing, but if you're growing, you are definitely not comfortable. And that should be kind of the lesson to take away. But on the other hand, if you've not had that experience, put yourself in that experience and be the only white person, and not just for like one night out or call ahead this or that or da-da-da, like make that, you know, an experience for you and stuff like that. Because, well, I'll just say for me, it's helpful, and I guess everyone's individual. The other part of it I'll say is use your money to invest in Black products and stuff like that. I'm drinking some of Kyrick's delicious lemonade. You can find her on Facebook. That hit the spot. And I would highly recommend everyone checking her stuff out, although she's fairly young. She has a very good job and stuff like that. And I'd also say Love on Black Women, and they have a website as well as a Facebook page, and maybe someone can drop that in the chat, or I can, Stephanie's on mute, but I can see her snapping, but someone can like put that on chat and stuff like that so people can see what that is. But yeah, those would be my two recommendations. If you're comfortable, you're not growing. If you're growing, you're not comfortable.
Thanks, Jonathan. And then, so this next one is another two-parter. In your journey, what mistakes have you made, and what did you learn or realize about yourself from those? And we're going to start with Kyle.
Sure. So as white folks, our mistakes are numerous, too numerous to count, and we're a huge liability often to the movement for justice. For me personally, I swing between two large mistakes. One is inaction and paralysis, and then the other one is taking up too much space and controlling, especially in circles of racial justice. So I've learned in all this work that I'm usually somewhere in between one of those two things. And so for proceeding, even despite the harm that I can create, is learning how to take real accountability. For me, that is way more important than doing any one thing right or one thing wrong. Is that one of my challenges? I can get super bogged down in overthinking about this all. And, you know, what is the right way? And is there the one right way? And I can study enough, I can figure out how to do this the right way. And that's just really not the case. We don't know the answers. The only thing I know for sure is that I'm usually going to make mistakes and create harm because of the lens of whiteness that I see the world through. And so I've just specifically learned how to focus on how I react to when I'm wrong or I'm creating harm, and then try to, as Stephanie mentioned, just decenter myself. A huge important skill to learn is just getting humble and decentering yourself, to listen authentically and empathetically when folks are telling you, and then to stay just super humble and keep your eye on the prize. I think that also leads to paralysis when you're doing something wrong, is that you can then pull away and say like, oh, I'm obviously creating harm, so I'm going to step out of this space. But it's how do you hear that, reduce your harm, but then stay committed and engaged to do even more action when you're wrong in a different way. So I usually have a good check on myself that if the work that I'm doing is moving power, if it's moving resources and money, if it's moving attention from white structures to Black-led organizations, I'm on the right track. And if I'm creating harm, I'm taking real accountability and fixing that is the biggest skill that I've used.
Thanks, Kyle. Stephanie B.
I'm muted first. Yes. So, I agree. A lot of the time, it's either you feel like, what can I do, right? And I never want to just jump in without understanding what the issue is, how The folks who are on the ground want me to proceed, taking stock. What do you need? How can I, like, what do you need me to do? Instead of like, what can I do? It's like, what do you need me to do? Instead of, so again, you're approaching it from the fact that like, you're simply just not the expert, because your expertise is in the thing that's causing the thing to be happening in the first place. Right. And so I also go between those where I want to make sure that what I'm doing is, moving things forward, putting my money where my mouth is, because capitalism exists, right? And so making sure that I'm supporting businesses, specifically Love on Black Women, especially, and making sure that I'm not also just checking in when horrible things happen, that I have a consistent, I ask friends like random life questions, and not making sure like if something on the news occurs, that's the only time I reach out to people. I make, that's an account on yourself as well. And just always having that reflexive note to know, read the room, one. And then two, there's a time where like listening and just reading is key, right? And that is something that I have learned over time. At the beginning of, my learning, I would just, I'd respond, I'd try to like be there as a voice. And now it's, okay, I see this as a problem. I see people are on it. What do you need me to do in this instance? Like, how can I best use my resources as an educator, as a person who has access to materials? Where would you like me to put my, where do you need this? Because like, just because I think where I can put my energy doesn't mean that that's the place where I put my energy, right? And so there's not always a time where you need to hear me. And it's making sure that I'm sort of knowing that, which is had to be learned over time for me, because I used to, get involved and be like, I'm here. I show up to protest with my sign, like Kyle at the beginning, and be like, here. But really, it's like understanding where that space and, energy is best for the people, friends, family, group, whatever that's in it. Because what I think might be me being like, I'm here, might not be actually the best thing. So it's very much reading the room, figuring out where that is, and understanding you're going to make mistakes. And then knowing that like being called in or called out, whichever it is part of that growth. And you're going to feel icky, probably. I know that when I've made a mistake, I feel icky, and I don't feel good, but I use that as a growing, it's impact intention, right? The impact that I have might not be the intention that I want to do, and to know the difference between how I react if I get defensive, or why I'm getting defensive, understand why I get defensive, and then use that to go forward if I get defensive, and how I'm reacting to that situation.
Thanks,
right?
Stephanie.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Stephanie R.
Similar to what Kyle said about, I get stuck between, and I mentioned this earlier, about between perfectionism and sense of urgency all the time. Something's happening and you want to be able to respond very quickly, and there's a lot of pressure and voices telling you to respond very quickly. But when you do that, you can make a lot of mistakes, especially when it comes to inclusivity. You want to make sure that if you're planning an action or some kind of event or something, that you're making sure that that's inclusive, that it's, you're trying to reduce the ableism that occurs in that space. And that takes a lot of thought and time to go through, making sure that you're doing things the right way. And then you want to make sure that you take that material and that you bounce it off the people that you feel that you work in accountability relationships with, and then take their feedback into account before you move forward with that. And that's hard. You have to have a thick skin to do that, because you're being told by a lot of people that you need to do something very quickly. But if you do something quickly, you could actually harm a lot of people too. I'm sure some people in the early surge days remembers when we did, some events trying to take down Taco Fest or whatever. And in retrospect, our signage was awful. It was terrible. It wasn't really conveying the right message. We didn't take into account the fact that there were a diversity of voices that we would be encountering in that space. So we made a lot of mistakes there. But from that experience, we actually learned so much about how we approach a call-in to show up at some kind of a horrible thing that a white person is doing. And that gave us a lot of steps to go through. And then on the other side of that, the perfectionism is that, you'll become, frozen if you're just working about trying to be perfect the whole time. And it's about trying a lot of different things and seeing what sticks. And something that might work in one situation might not work in the next situation. So you have to be able to kind of pivot really quickly and do that kind of nuanced movement in a space. And yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Thanks, Stephanie. So we're back to Jonathan.
Sorry, what's the question one more time? I was looking up Carrick's lemonade stuff.
Yep, that's okay. What mistakes have you made and what did you learn about yourself?
Oh man, yeah. So that's the question I was talking about earlier that I was gonna come back to. So basically, like I said, growing up, I would hear all sorts of stories from my peers rather, in school and things of that nature, where it would be just kind of normal talk about different interactions with the police that were extremely harsh and stuff that was not all my life experience. And this was a pretty consistent narrative. I don't remember exactly how far back it goes, but maybe 5th grade or 4th grade or stuff like that or whatever. And I remember a couple of specific instances, but also just in general, this was kind of a consistent theme. And I always would be thinking to myself, man, what the hell? Why are these, people who I'm friends with and I know trying to lie to me? Is this for sympathy? Are people trying to get attention? What the hell is going on here? Why is this keep happening? Why do they keep saying this? Because I know it's not true. In my mind, I'm this is my narrative I'm telling myself. I know it's not true because that's not the police. The police are bubblegum and baseball cards. So why does this keep happening? Why do I keep saying this stuff? Is it just, a cry for attention, that type of stuff? And as it turned out, I got a little bit older and, would become a teenager and realize that it was a much larger world out there, and my own kind of myopic view of how things happen in my life experience doesn't dictate what's actually going on. And I would, in some sense, I guess, grow from that situation and learn a little more about what's going on in the world. But nonetheless, at that time, I didn't often confront people about it and be like, no, you're lying, that type of stuff. But it was something I definitely didn't believe. And I was like, what the hell? That's not right. And I don't know. It just really sticks with me now, I guess, because of everything going on. But I'll never forget that. And I've talked to, and I've remained friends actually with, it's back in elementary school, I suppose, or stuff like that or whatever, and middle school to a certain degree. And I'm still in touch because I'm from Milwaukee my whole life. But, and I've had those conversations now, but even back then I was like, man, this is not right. But that kind of growth experience I have, and again, learning a little more and becoming keen to this, this is actually happening. Police brutality is real, and, fitting the description's real. Someone walking home on 6th and North once a week getting pulled over and messed with by the cops is real. Not only that, but the trauma of having, especially as a little kid, and sometimes you get a gun pulled on you or put to your head, or sometimes you get thrown against a car on a hot day or on the concrete or stuff like that. And that adds up. And not only that, it obviously informs your interaction overall with, police officers, stuff like that. And, your heart might start palpitating or other PTSD type of stuff and all that stuff as well. So, and that's something we should all be considering right now, especially, but also in general. But anyway, I mention that because I see that phenomenon happening a lot these days. I have that conversation a lot with people, and I know, I get it. As a, very racist white kid growing up who was not believing stuff from people just because it was different life experience, they're black, whatever, I get it. And I totally understand. I get it because I lived it. So I get it even more than you might get it because I get it. And from their perspective, it's well, they might still be in that phase. And again, I don't think it has to do with age as much as kind of experience. It doesn't matter if I was a little kid or a grown man or whatever, but people who are now kind of going through this process of well, but that's not how police behave, but there's cell phone video, and wow, is this actually happening more? But is it only caught on the cell phone? Does it happen outside of it? Or and I see people kind of wheel spinning, going through the same process now. And I think it's very relevant and very important that we learn from those mistakes, but we also don't, we don't gaslight people and be acting in that way anymore as well either, and say oh, that actually isn't, or oh, is that, you're asking for it, or is this or that or that type mentality. and just be like, just listen, just hear, and just accept that because it wasn't your life experience doesn't mean it wasn't someone else's, and that that reality might be a fatality for someone else, while yours might just be like a little like what's it, with the other panelists, it's a little slap on the wrist, like, oh, you look like my daughter, or whatever she's talking about, type stuff. So I think to a certain extent, listen, believe, and realize that it's okay to go through that transition. And you know what? I'll just say one more thing on that. If I would have stuck to my ego and like not even gotten that in my head and been like, oh no, I'm right, and like this can't be true, and da-da-da, and I wouldn't have even allowed myself to expand that mentality. And I'll say this too, my change in mentality wasn't from, I have had direct life experiences where I've been, driving the car with other people and stuff like that, but it wasn't from that, it was before that. And it's a shift to make internally type stuff. And I think, being willing to do that and have that is very important, especially right now. And I don't think it, again, matters age as much as experience, but we all have the opportunity, and we should all take that into consideration and be very deliberate about that.
Okay, thanks. Kirsten, what mistakes have you made and how'd you learn?
Well, I mean, I'm a straight white woman who grew up in Cedarburg, Wisconsin, and have a conservative family. So like my life is filled with mistakes of my youth, right? Like when you're born into a conservative viewpoint, in a very privileged environment, like it's almost baked into you to think that these things aren't real. So you just stumble upon yourself over and over and make really stupid remarks for, a period of time until you start to realize that there's this bigger world around you. And so I would say there's this point where you just start to kind of wake up a little bit. And so I know for me, really, I spend a lot of time thinking about all of these things and how to actually have meaningful action. We have a lot of questions about like having difficult conversations and managing emotions and burnout and all of that sort of stuff. And so like, what I would say is that there's this, once you start to wake up to your privilege, there's almost like this frantic energy of needing to fix things and solve problems. It's like that white privilege starts to poke its head out and be like, let's fix things, solutions, find them now. And so you see everybody around us, their energy levels start to just like increase like this, like they're amplifying. And just because your energy is rising around this and you're waking up to something doesn't necessarily mean that you're effective in dismantling systems of oppression. And so for me, I really like to look at this from a perspective of head, heart, and hands, because that's really, in my opinion, and all of my professional experience, the best way to motivate change within yourself and within your family, your communities, your organizations. It's about the headpieces around like, how do you mentally build the rationale that can connect with people on moving things forward? The head is around the heart is around how do you emotionally connect to people in a way that resonates with an experience or a situation deep within their heart to motivate them to create that and foster that change in their world and in their lives. But it's also about hands, and it's teaching people about how to use the information in their head and in their heart to then transform that into community action in meaningful ways. And I think like that kind of pathway is something that we're struggling with right now as white people, to get out of that frantic energy of like, holy shit, this is awful, we need to change things immediately, and into like, okay, how do you actually go about doing that then? And so we've been spending a lot of time kind of putting like ideas together, especially because of our mental health background, as well as community activism and D&I. And so we've actually been putting together kind of a framework for some of this called Privilege Awakening. And we've put together kind of 5 stages for people of like moving from this emotional franticness all the way through being a functional ally, and what that means and how do you activate in the community. And so for us, that, I mean, in my opinion, that looks around things like soft skills and emotional intelligence, right? Like, how do you cultivate the kinds of soft skills within you to tackle this both for yourself and for the people around you? It's about like learning how to lean in as well as lean out, right? It's like that action versus sitting back, and learning what is the right point to do all of this. And those are things that like I always struggle with. I'm a lady who likes some action, clearly. And so I have to learn to take myself back and all of that. And then it's also about like strategic engagement, right? Like, what are the things that you can do in your life, in your community, that will have the biggest change, that resonate with your heart again, right? Like, doing things that aren't aligned with your heart won't matter. So how do we align strategically all of these different bits and pieces? And so, yeah, I mean, it's a lot of stuff to deal with, but I think it's really important to like start actually putting some framework all around all of this and helping people. So we're having a pilot in July. So if anybody wants to sign up for that or get involved, let me know.
Thank you. Okay, so I want to be really cognizant of time. So I'm going to say a couple of things. But first, panelists, you're going to get a one-sentence response to this question. How does your anti-racism show up in your everyday circle of influence, knowing that we all come from different spots? But I'm going to say a couple of things. Maddie's been keeping track of questions and is going to follow up with resources. So we're going to skip that question for now, but I know there's a lot of resources that have been compiled. And we know this isn't our last panel on something like this. And before I give them that last one sentence, I want to reiterate that if you haven't listened to the link of the audio from the February panel that Maddie sent out, please do. It is coming from Milwaukeeans who are asking you and telling you how to show up. And it is really, really powerful and very helpful. And these were a host of conversations that they've been having, but please listen to that. And that's all for me. But so we're going to start with Stephanie R. One sentence. How does anti-racism show up in your everyday circle of influence? Unmute.
Maybe that's how it shows up, right? I keep myself on mute. I just make sure that I'm aware of how my whiteness is impacting any space that I'm in, be it my job, the supermarket, the parks, the bus I'm riding, events I'm going to, the churches I'm attending, the neighborhood I live in. It's impacting everywhere just by being in that space.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Sorry, question one more time.
I'm on mute. How does your anti-racism show up in your everyday circle of influence?
Show my everyday circle of influence. I'm very confrontational by nature, and I confront people a lot and get in people's faces because that's my nature.
Okay. Kirsten.
I would say that my my life is about all of these things at this point. And so I just try to continue to show up for myself, for my community, for creating a better world for everyone and dismantling systems of oppression around me and just committing to that every day. And if you approach that from a place of authenticity and curiosity and support, I don't think that you can go too wrong because you'll find the right direction to go in.
Kyle.
Sure. So if you do one thing today for me, it's to set up a monthly tithing towards Black and Brown organizers and follow the leadership and calls to action. For me, it's like a subscription service to anti-racism, and I do it for Love on Black Women, like was mentioned, Lit Milwaukee, Block, and Cash App Ubuntu Research.
Cool. And Stephanie B.
I do, there's many folks where you could Cash App, Venmo, etc. Love on Black Women, which has already been said, but it's reading, it's doing my own research and not using other folks as my personal Google, because that undoes all the things that you want to do. And it's staying accountable and collecting folks on Facebook and social media. That's what I do.
Thanks, Stephanie. And Maddie, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our moderator. Again, this is not the first nor the last conversation that we will have on race and racism, so please stay tuned. Feel free to reach out to me at any point in time. Always willing to have a conversation. Have a great rest of your Tuesday. It's Tuesday. Yes, it's Tuesday. Have a great rest of your Tuesday. And I hope to hear from all of you soon. And we'll send you all an email and a survey to follow up with our conversation today. So I hope you guys have a great day.